So I'm playing a Putin move south again. So these are points relating to my recent play, which is actually most of turn 1. Very interesting. Again, Putin moves south, struggle for the Eurasian heartland. Needless to say, this is really coming together for me. I'm really seeing the, well, there's certainly a lot that's interesting going on here. Still thinking about, in more detail, it's just hard to, it's hard to take in the linkage between the design mechanics here and real world operations at this scale and scope. Ground scale, 100 kilometer hexes, quite big. Units are anywhere from a brigade. Wait, no, there are not brigades in this game actually. I don't think I've seen brigades. Definitely corps-sized task forces. Yeah, the ground unit. Actually, are they all corps-sized units? Actually, every unit I'm seeing, I take that back. Well, where I was going earlier with this, every unit is corps or corps-sized task force. Okay, so that's the unit scale. Of course, you have your SF units of varying size. The air units, I think, are quite vague. I think they just represent large increments of combat power. Pretty vague, I think. Okay. Point, wow, big discrepancy in starting action points. So in general, each side at the start of the turn rolls 2d6, and that is the number of action points you'll have for that turn. There's a shock marker, and the Russians started this scenario with the shock marker, and they played it. Again, I don't see why you hold on to it. Yeah, well, I guess unless you want to not give it up. But there only being 10 turns in a game, that doesn't seem to be, I don't know, doesn't seem to be much behind that strategy either. So anyways, the Russian side went ahead and used their shock marker on the first turn to roll an extra die. So they actually rolled 3d6 for action points. Anyways, a huge discrepancy. The Russians rolled 16. Again, 3 dice 6 playing the shock marker, and the coalition rolled a measly 5. So 16-5 starting AP discrepancy, 3-1 Russian favor. That was huge. Okay, and it really showed. So I had the Russians try as their opening strategy to really, try a shock and awe campaign, try to be very aggressive, and actually see, starting with 16-5 advantage in action points, turn 1, can the Russians kind of knock back the coalition really significantly, such that they can never catch up. Okay, so that was that. Discrepancy in action points really makes it. Oh, and what's really interesting is that I think I had a total of 3 using these special forces insurgency operations, which means rolling on the insurgency table. A roll of a 1, which is bad, is called blowback, and that means that the side that's executing that SF insurgency operation actually gives the opponent an action point. And I think with all the SF insurgency operations I had the Russians doing, they actually rolled a total of 3 blowback results. So actually the coalition, while they started with 5, effectively they had 8 points altogether so far. We are getting towards the end of turn 1, by the way. There are only 2 action points left for the coalition and 6 points left for the Russians. So we're definitely on the closing stretch of turn 1. Another point, wow, random roll on the starting scenario setup table, which I like a lot. I rolled a 1, which is really interesting. The meaning of that is that Iran and China, they're out of the game entirely. So you remove their units and their territory is no-go. So that means that Iran in the west and China in the east, you have these no-go zones now. And so effectively your front is really, let's see, it's at least halved. The front is at least halved. So basically you're fighting between Herat, Afghanistan, and Almaty, was that Almaty, Kazakhstan? Drastically narrows the front. And it just, it creates a very interesting situation. And because of this narrow front, this might be a good, just playing with and not rolling the die, but just choosing to play with variant number 1, which is the one, which is the die roll 1 result. Just don't roll on the table and play with that one. Might be a good a good way to start the game when you first start playing, to get used to it. I think it simplifies a lot of things. Simplifies the situation at least. Interesting. And that's what I'm playing here. Another point, yeah, the SF insurgency operations option is really interesting. Again, it changes control of cities, and when you change a city with a major base, like I did, again, I had the coalition, I used the coalition SF units to turn Karaganda in Kazakhstan, that being a major base. That is victory points, as well as a modifier to the AP die roll. Okay. So the whole SF insurgency operation I still find quite fascinating. Another point, air superiority offensive. So with the Russians starting with greater than 3-to-1 advantage in AP, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to buy a bunch of air units and really emphasize the air superiority operation or offensive? And so in simulation terms, I was thinking, what if the Russians launch major air offensive, try to knock down the coalition, maybe even knock out all of its starting air early on, see what difference that makes. Now the one thing is that it's what I had in mind and what realistically had to happen for the Russians to really launch an overwhelming air offensive is that it had to be done a few times. Okay, what does that mean? That means take a handful of the Russian starting air units, conduct an air superiority operation or offensive. Then when the action comes around to the Russian side again, because all those units are going to be put in the reinforcements pool, so then you buy a reinforcement action, which is a die roll, so you're chancing it, right? So I think I used 5 air units right off the bat. So those 5 units go to the reinforcement pool. Next time I buy a reinforcement action, I roll a die. I could roll 6. I could get all 5 back plus 1, or I could roll just 1, in which case I used 5 and only got 1 back on the next action. But anyways, it worked out. I rolled, I get them back, I launch again. I launch an offensive again. That's what I mean by, you can do this a number of times. You can, basically you're cycling your air units through in the same turn. It's not for free. Of course, it costs action points. Finally, putting reinforcements is very interesting if you have a controlled military base behind enemy lines.